Imagine stepping back into the year 1972. You're standing on the curb outside your local airport. The building in front of you doesn't look like a hyper-modern maze of glass and steel. Instead, it looks like something between a civic monument and a futuristic pavilion, complete with sweeping curves, giant windows, and colorful signage welcoming you to the world of air travel. You can almost hear the soft hum of a nearby jukebox, mixing with the roar of jet engines outside. Air travel in the 1970s wasn't just about getting from point A to point B, it was about the ritual. The sense that you were doing something truly extraordinary. For many people, flying was still a once-in-a-lifetime adventure. Unlike today, when you can buy a $99 ticket on a budget airline and complain about the lack of legroom. In the 1970s, you dressed up for the occasion. You treated it with respect because it was expensive, it was rare, and it was considered glamorous. But before you could even walk into that airport, you had to secure your golden ticket. And in the 70s, that process was a journey in itself. Booking a flight back then meant calling up the airline or walking into a travel agency. Picture this: shag carpeting on the floor, posters of Hawaiian beaches or Parisian boulevards on the walls, and a sharply dressed travel agent sitting behind a polished wooden desk. There was no Google, no Kayak, no best deals for next weekend. Instead, the agent had giant printed timetables, fare books, and maybe even a computer terminal hooked up to the airline's reservation system, though those were still relatively new. You'd tell the agent where you wanted to go, and they'd search for the right flight, often flipping through pages of options. The ticket you received was nothing like the flimsy boarding passes of today. It was a multi-page ticket booklet with carbon copies and official stamps. It felt important because it was. If you lost it, you weren't flying. You guarded it like treasure. Now let's talk cost. This is where things get real. In the 70s, flying was not cheap. A round trip from New York to London could cost you the equivalent of $1,800 to $2,500 in today's money. A domestic cross-country ticket might run you $600 to $800. That meant the majority of passengers were businessmen, well-off families, or travelers splurging on the trip of a lifetime. Because ticket prices were regulated by the government, airlines weren't competing with low fares. Instead, they competed on service. Every ad, every poster, every TV commercial was selling you on the idea that flying wasn't just travel, it was luxury. Pan Am told you they would make you feel like the most important person in the world. United told you to fly the friendly skies. TWA ran ads showing glamorous meals and champagne being poured at 30,000 feet. Of course, there was also the darker side of that advertising. Airlines routinely used sexist imagery to market flights. The most infamous campaign of the decade came from National Airlines. Their Fly Me ads featured smiling stewardesses with the suggestive tagline, "I'm Cheryl, fly me." These ads sold fantasy more than reality, and while they reflected the social norms of the time, they're shocking to modern eyes. Still, they reveal how airlines positioned their service as glamorous, indulgent, and even seductive. With your ticket in hand, you were ready for the airport. And stepping into a 1970s terminal was like stepping onto a stage. Airports then weren't designed for efficiency the way they are now. They were designed for style, for spectacle, and for the sense of anticipation. Walk into the TWA Flight Center at JFK with its swooping white curves and bright red carpeting, and you felt like you were entering the future. Step into LAX with its iconic theme building, and you felt like you were walking onto the set of a sci-fi film. Inside, the mood was relaxed. Security was minimal. In fact, until the early 70s, you could literally walk straight to the gate without showing any identification. Families and friends often came along just to wave goodbye at the boarding gate. It wasn't until a string of hijackings in the late 60s and early 70s that basic screening began. Metal detectors, bag checks, but even then, the process was quick, simple, and nothing like the TSA gauntlet we know today. And yes, people smoked. Everywhere. In the terminal, in the gate lounges, in the restaurants. Ashtrays were built into every piece of furniture. The smell of cigarette smoke mixed with perfume and coffee was simply part of the air travel atmosphere. Passengers dressed the part too. Flying was an event. Men wore suits or sports jackets, women wore dresses, skirts, or chic pantsuits. Children were dressed in their nicest outfits. Nobody showed up in sweatpants or flip-flops. To be seen at the airport was to be seen as someone important. Waiting to board was often enjoyable. Airports had cocktail lounges, full-service restaurants, even piano bars in some locations. People watching was part of the fun. And when the time came to board, the process was straightforward. None of the elaborate group numbers or zone calls of today. You handed over your paper ticket, walked down the jet bridge, and stepped into the aircraft. Or, in many cases, you walked across the tarmac and climbed a portable staircase, waving to family members who were pressed up against the windows inside.
Oh.
That moment, looking up at the massive fuselage of a Boeing 747, was unforgettable. Stepping onto a plane in the 1970s was like entering a different universe, especially if it was a jumbo jet. The Boeing 747, which entered service in 1970, changed everything. For the first time, planes could carry hundreds of passengers in wide-body comfort. The sheer scale of it was breathtaking. Walking down the aisle of a 747 for the first time felt like stepping into a hotel ballroom. Airlines knew they had something special, and they designed their cabins to impress. Forget the bland, uniform interiors of modern aircraft. The 70s, cabins exploded with color and style. Think burnt orange, avocado green, mustard yellow, deep red. Carpets were thick, seats were wide, and overhead bins were more like small shelves than today's massive containers. And then there were the lounges. Yes, actual lounges on planes. The upper deck of many early 747s was a dedicated lounge space, complete with sofas, cocktail bars, and sometimes even pianos. Airlines like Continental, American, and United experimented with full bars in the main cabin, where passengers could mingle, drink, and even dance. These weren't gimmicks, they were real attempts to make flying feel like a social event, not just transportation. The seating itself was spacious. Even in economy, you had more legroom than many premium seats today. Seat pitch averaged 34 to 36 inches, compared to the 30 to 31 inches common now. First class was positively luxurious, with wide recliners, footrests, and ample space. But the real star of the experience was the food. Forget tiny bags of pretzels or overpriced snack boxes. In the 70s, in-flight dining was fine dining. Airlines served multi-course meals on real china with metal cutlery. Menus featured steak, lobster, roast chicken, even caviar on international flights. Flight attendants rolled carts down the aisle with trays of appetizers and desserts. Coffee was poured into porcelain cups. Wine and cocktails flowed freely, included in the price of your ticket. Some airlines even carved roast beef in the aisle, like a flying banquet hall. And yes, you could smoke throughout the meal. Ashtrays were built into every armrest, and cigarette smoke drifted through the cabin at all times. Non-smoking sections existed, but the air circulation wasn't strong enough to keep the smoke contained. Simply part of the flying experience. Entertainment was more limited than today, but it was still a novelty. Movies were projected onto screens at the front of each cabin, and everyone watched the same film. Headsets, sometimes plastic tubes carrying sound. Later, more modern headphones were handed out so you could listen. Music channels played through the armrest audio system. Passengers also read books, magazines, or simply chatted with their neighbors. Flying was slower, more social. People weren't glued to their own devices, they were sharing the experience. Flight attendants, called stewardesses at the time, were central to the image of 70s air travel. Airlines marketed them as glamorous, stylish, even seductive. Uniforms were designed by top fashion houses featuring bold colors, miniskirts, go-go boots, and sometimes even themed outfits for certain routes. The job was considered glamorous, but it came with strict rules. Airlines imposed weight limits, age caps, and appearance standards. Many required flight attendants to be unmarried. It was a job as much about image as about service. Despite the glamour, flying in the 70s had its challenges. Turbulence was common, and planes weren't as quiet or smooth as today's jets. Pressurization wasn't as advanced, so ears popped constantly. Delays were frequent, and communication wasn't as streamlined. Passengers often sat for hours with little information. And then there was the issue of safety. While the 70s were innovative, they were also a time of growing pains. The decade saw several high-profile accidents, partly due to the rapid introduction of new aircraft technology and partly due to less advanced safety protocols. Hijackings were disturbingly common in the early part of the decade, with planes diverted to Cuba or held for ransom. This created real anxiety, even as airlines tried to maintain the image of glamour and calm. Still, for most passengers, the overall memory of flying in the 70s is one of excitement and luxury. Stepping onto a plane meant stepping into another world. The sound of engines roaring, the clink of glasses in the cabin, the laughter from the lounge upstairs, it all created an atmosphere of magic. As the 1970s rolled on, the world of air travel stood at a fascinating crossroads. On one hand, it had never been more glamorous. The jumbo jet was still new. The Concorde was grabbing headlines, and airlines were locked in a never-ending competition to outdo one another in service, style, and spectacle. On the other hand, the cracks in the system were beginning to show. Costs were high, hijackings were in the news, and government regulation kept prices artificially inflated, making flying something that many dreamed about but few could actually afford. But let's stay with the magic for a moment. Imagine it's 1976, and you're one of the lucky few to board the Concorde. From the outside, the aircraft looked like nothing else in the sky. Sleek, needle-nosed, with delta-shaped wings and afterburning engines that roared like rockets, stepping aboard felt like stepping into the future. The cabin itself was surprisingly small, just 100 seats arranged in a 2-to-2 configuration. It wasn't the wide, cavernous interior of the Boeing 747. Instead, it was more intimate, almost like a private club. You'd sink into your leather seat, sip champagne, and within minutes, you'd be roaring down the runway faster than any other commercial jet in existence. As the nose lifted and the afterburners kicked in, you were pressed back into your seat as Concorde clawed its way into the sky. And then came the magic moment, Mach 1. The plane pierced the sound barrier, and you were now flying faster than a bullet. Mach 2 followed soon after, and the world outside your window blurred. At 60,000 feet, you could see the curvature of the Earth. The sky wasn't blue anymore, it was dark, almost black. You were halfway to space. The flight from New York to London, which normally took 7 hours on a 747, lasted just over 3. Concorde turned a long-haul slog into a decadent sprint. Businessmen could leave London after lunch, land in New York before lunch was even over, and be home for dinner. Celebrities adored it. Phil Collins famously used Concorde to perform at both Live Aid concerts in London and Philadelphia on the same day. The rich and famous sipped champagne, ate lobster, talked deals in the stratosphere, while the rest of the world looked up at the sonic boom trailing across the sky. Of course, Concorde was never practical. Tickets were astronomically expensive, thousands of dollars even then, the equivalent of over $10,000 in today's money. And the sonic boom meant the aircraft could only fly supersonic over oceans. But as a symbol of the 1970s, Concorde represented the pinnacle of the dream of flight. Glamorous, futuristic, and thrilling. For most people, though, the dream lived inside the Boeing 747. The jumbo jet had democratized long-haul travel not completely, since tickets were still pricey, but more people could now fly than ever before. Airlines took full advantage of its size, filling upper decks with lounges, building in-flight bars, and creating spaces that felt more like cocktail parties than airplanes. Some of the experiments were wild. American Airlines installed a piano bar on some of their 747s, where passengers could gather around a live piano player and sing songs while flying across the country. Continental created conversation pits, sunken seating areas where groups of passengers could lounge face-to-face, drink in hand like they were in a nightclub. United built full bars where you could order cocktails shaken and stirred in the sky. For a few years, it seemed like every airline was trying to turn their planes into flying nightclubs, and passengers loved it. But this era of extravagance couldn't last forever. Lounges, piano bars, and conversation pits took up space that could otherwise be filled with paying passengers. As the decade wore on and profits tightened, airlines realized they needed to maximize capacity. Slowly, the lounges disappeared. The piano bars were removed. The cocktail lounges were replaced with rows of seats. Efficiency started to win over glamour. Another factor that loomed large over the decade was safety and security. While flying had become relatively safe compared to earlier decades, accidents still happened with troubling frequency. The 1970s saw some of the deadliest aviation disasters in history. including the Tenerife airport disaster in 1977, when two 747s collided on the runway in fog, killing 583 people. Incidents like this reminded the world that air travel, for all its glamour, carried risks. Hijackings were another constant concern. In the late 60s and early 70s, planes were hijacked with alarming regularities, sometimes multiple times in a single week. Many were politically motivated, often involving demands to be flown to Cuba. Others were ransom attempts. At one point, hijackings were so common that comedians joked about passengers asking, "Are we going to Havana today?" Airlines initially tried to downplay the threat, but eventually, governments stepped in. By 1973, metal detectors and X-ray machines became standard in U.S. airports, marking the beginning of modern airport security. Still, it was nothing like the security theater we endure today. You could arrive 20 minutes before your flight, breeze through a quick check, and be at the gate in no time. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, a massive change was brewing that would reshape air travel forever. Deregulation. Up until the late 70s, airlines in the U.S. operated under strict government regulation. The Civil Aeronautics Board set fares, determined routes, and essentially controlled the market. This meant airlines couldn't compete on price. Instead, they competed on service, leading to the golden age of luxury in the skies. But it also meant that fares stayed high, limiting access to the wealthy and the middle class. In 1978, the Airline Deregulation Act was passed in the United States, and everything changed. Airlines were suddenly free to set their own fares and routes. Competition exploded. New carriers emerged, offering lower prices. For the first time, flying became accessible to the average family. The democratization of air travel had begun, but with it came the end of the golden age. Lounges, piano bars, and extravagant meals gave way to rows of seats, cost-cutting, and the rise of the no-frills airline. Looking back, the 1970s were the last decade when flying still felt like something special. Passengers dressed up, meals were served with flair, planes had space, style, and personality. The Concorde was streaking across the Atlantic, and 747s were carrying record numbers of passengers across oceans. Flying wasn't just transportation, it was part of the adventure. But it's important not to let nostalgia paint too rosy a picture. For all its glamour, flying in the 70s had its flaws. It was prohibitively expensive, keeping many people grounded. The constant haze of cigarette smoke made cabins uncomfortable and unhealthy. Sexism was baked into the culture, from advertising campaigns to the strict appearance rules imposed on stewardesses. Safety, while improving, was still not at today's levels. What makes the 70s so fascinating is this very contradiction. It was an era when air travel stood balanced between the exclusive glamour of the early jet age and the mass-market accessibility of the deregulated era to come. It was the decade when the dream of flight was at its most vivid, when airlines sold not just a seat, but an experience, and when passengers truly felt like stepping onto a plane was stepping into another world. The legacy of 70s air travel lives on in our imagination. Pan Am, long gone, still symbolizes glamour in the sky. Vintage photos of stewardesses in bold uniforms and passengers clinking champagne glasses in upper-deck lounges circulate online, fueling nostalgia. The Concorde, retired in 2003, remains a symbol of what air travel once promised but could never quite deliver. Speed, luxury, and futurism, all in one. When we compare that world to flying today, the contrast is stark. Today, air travel is safer, more efficient, and more affordable than ever before. Billions of people fly every year, something unimaginable in the 70s. But the glamour is gone. Cabins are crowded, meals cost extra, and passengers board in sweatpants, earbuds in, barely looking out the window. The magic has been replaced by routine, and yet maybe that's why the 70s hold such fascination for us. They remind us of a time when flying was still infused with wonder. When you dress your best, savor your meal, and sip champagne while watching clouds drift by. When stepping onto a plane meant stepping into the future, and when the journey itself was just as memorable as the destination. So, what was it really like to fly in the 1970s? It was glamorous, stylish, and thrilling. It was also smoky, expensive, and sometimes chaotic. It was a golden age that shimmered brightly but couldn't last. And for those lucky enough to have experienced it, it remains a memory of the sky at its most magical. Today, when we shuffle through security, squeeze into economy seats, and grumble about baggage fees, maybe it's worth remembering that once, not so long ago, flying truly felt like an adventure. And in the 1970s, the golden age of air travel, it absolutely was. Now tell us, were you one of the lucky ones to travel in the 70s? Let us know in the comments. And please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.